my whole career, I have been in systems where there are some brilliant staff and there are some awful staff. And the awful staff, I suppose in the early days, I was mostly angry and hostile to them. And I suppose in the later days of my career, I started thinking more about what was going on for people that was making this work so difficult for them. And I think we left a lot of people behind, staff, with their own trauma of the work that they never resolved. And we're now, in some ways, acting out in their relational encounters with services. And it is part of that bigger issue of how the system turned against people, that at a micro level, a lot of relationships became quite uncaring and rejecting.
Hello, and welcome to Locked Up Living, the podcast which looks at resilience in challenging organisations, such as, but not only, prisons and hospitals for mentally ill prisoners and patients. My name is David Jones, and together with Naomi Murphy, I present your Locked Up Living podcast. Today we welcome Dr. Neil Gordon, who is a forensic psychotherapist and has worked for over 40 years as a senior clinician and supervisor in high secure and community settings. He's conducted research into the client's view of psychotherapy and has explored how psychotherapists in high secure environments adapt their therapeutic style in a context-sensitive way. He has a professional doctorate in psychotherapy and holds master's degrees in organisational development and consultancy and in advanced mental health practice. He co-developed and delivered the Schema therapy group program at Rampton High Secure Hospital with Dr Kerry Beckley and was formerly responsible for multidisciplinary training and workforce development in the personality disorder service. He worked as a senior fellow in the Institute of Mental Health, Nottingham University, where he was responsible for the development of the National Personality Disorder Knowledge and Understanding Framework, KUF, or commonly called CUF, which was commissioned by the UK Department of Health and Ministry of Justice. He's published articles on a wide range of topics, including schema therapy, personality disorder, organisational change, mental health, education and qualitative research. He co-edited a textbook on working positively with the challenges of personality disorder in secure settings, which was published by Wiley in 2010. So, welcome, Neil. That's quite a biography. Can you tell us how you came to follow this particular pathway in life?
Yeah, well, I just wanted to say for your listeners that I recently had surgery on my jaw, and I'm aware that my voice can sound a little slurred because I have a damaged nerve in my lip that makes articulation a bit difficult. So just bear with it, and I'll try and be as clear as I can in my articulation. Well, I suppose I started very much in the 1970s. I trained as a mental health nurse in rural Aberdeenshire in a hospital called King's Seat, which no longer exists. It's gone with many of the institutions. And I trained there at a time, I suppose, where quite a lot of the staff in the institution were trained in the 1950s and 60s. So it was quite a radical introduction to institutional care, and I suppose to some of the issues that I became interested in for the rest of my career, in terms of, I suppose, how the institutions themselves, although well-intentioned, had many practices and, I suppose, staff behaviours that I saw as quite negative and destructive in terms of the lack of compassion and care. But I enjoyed working there because I found the environment was filled with some really impressive people who wanted to see change, with a sort of mixture of people who were quite resistant and didn't want to see that change. So I suppose in terms of my career trajectory, my interest started there around topics of relational work, and the role of staff on the front line became a particular interest, because I was very sensitive to how people from different backgrounds responded to the demands of frontline work. And I was very aware how unsupported people were in those struggles. So when I look at how my career progressed, I became interested in psychotherapy and did a local psychoanalytically informed training there with David Lepoidevin, who was one of the psychiatrists. And I worked with him as an individual and group therapist for some years. And then I suppose I moved into education. I became it's a job that I don't think exists anymore, but I was what was called a clinical teacher. And that was somebody who worked in clinical environments but was attached to a training college. And that allowed me to follow that focus on what was happening on the ground and the front line, while also having an educational role.
Was this still in Scotland, Neil?
This was still in Scotland, yes. I was still based in Aberdeen. I went off from Aberdeen and then went to work in Nottingham, where I worked at Mapley Hospital, which is another institution. But I was involved there predominantly in the clinical education work at what was called the District Psychiatric Education Centre. And I suppose my work there was very much about developing postgraduate programs that help professionals work with practice. So I got very interested in the themes of clinical supervision, reflective practice, and developed and taught several programs. I worked in the Nottingham Psychotherapy unit there with Mark Eveline, again for some years. And I suppose that work then led me I moved to work in London, and I worked at Middlesex and the University of North London, and got linked up with the Tavistock Institute and did some work there, teaching on their master's programs. And I maintained a clinical caseload throughout my career, because I had this frame that the work was very much about being in contact with the person, as opposed to having nice, fancy, tidy theories about what to do with people that you were faced with. And I suppose that's the theme that brought me to work at Rampton. I was recruited there to develop a post-reg degree program for staff in the personality disorder service. And from that, I became the head of workforce in that service and did quite a lot of development work, both with nursing and qualified and unqualified staff and the MDT teams. And I also developed the Schema therapy model there with Kerry and the directorate. And in about 2007 or 8, I was approached to take on the work related to the KOF, prepare a bid for it, and that was successful after some years of very hard work. And then I implemented the KOF over the next 10-year period, while I carried on working clinically at Rampton and also started then doing more national focused work. And I ran the KOF MST for about 10 years. And that really took me to my retirement in 2019.
Thank you, Neil. That's a very clear exposition of the range of work that you've done. Early on, I think I heard you mention that when you began working in Scotland, in Aberdeen, I think you said, that it was quite radical. It was quite a radical setting, and I suppose I'm thinking that obviously Maxwell Jones began in Scotland and then came down to London to educate the rest of us. Was it that kind of influence that you were referring to there?
Well, I did actually do some visits to Dingleton when I was actually up in Scotland many, many years ago. So the therapeutic community model, I think, was very much prominent in some of the environments I worked in. But they weren't therapeutic communities proper in the Maxwell Jones sense. I think that some of the innovation was about, I suppose, working with people who'd been in hospital for long periods and trying to be more creative in our response to improving their quality of life that they experienced. And I think some of that was about innovative staff who brought something new to our quite stale institutional setting that was struggling to really move away from the kind of institutionalized care that was very common then.
Yeah, that's a very interesting point, because I think in a way what you're highlighting is that in some respects the level of relational work or relational type work was kind of increasing and improving, whilst at the same time there were certain attitudes, sort of rather fixed attitudes, which were still in place around about that time.
Yeah. And I think that tension between we'll say the radicals and the more conservative institutionalized staff, I think that's been a feature of my whole career. I think that when I first went to Rampton, I actually taught in Rampton in the 1980s. I used to go in and teach on their post-registration courses. And the staff used to turn up for their sessions with me on relational learning, wearing their uniforms and their hats. And it was quite an odd experience to be working in a room talking about relationships with people wearing, well, very much like the old prison guard uniform with a peaked cap and a blue outfit. And I suppose I saw when I went back to Rampton some nearly 20 years later how much had shifted. But some of that, in some ways, the uniform was still being carried in the mind of many of the staff.
Yeah, I think we're more or less of the same generation, Neil, and the first hospital I started work in was Littlemore in Oxford, which was divided into the A side and the B side. And the B side staff still wore uniforms, or the nursing staff wore their uniforms. And of course the A side tried to operate as a therapeutic community. Those were the days.
So really good to have you here today, Neil, and to have this conversation with you. One of the things you talk about a fair bit is about relational work, and that seems to be a phrase that's come back into fashion, but in terms of psychological language. Could you say a bit about what you understand by this phrase?
Well, I suppose there's been a struggle in the last few years to identify and, I suppose, give a definition of relational work. But for me, it's something about understanding that relationships with the people we're trying to help are the primary focus. I think that in the last few years, our care and our approaches have become increasingly mechanized and manualized, and I think sometimes the relationship is forgotten. And that sounds really odd in our field to talk about relationships being forgotten, but I think they have. So for me, it's about emphasizing that every piece of work we're doing is relational. It is about connection with another person. And I think most importantly, it's about a meaningful, attached relationship with that person. And that goes for whether you work as a psychologist, a prison officer. There is something about the roles we have become a bit detached from that relational dimension. And for me, all our development work in this area should be focused on relational work.
I think it gives a lot more power to all of the staff. Not power, but a lot more therapeutic power, doesn't it? To every contact with staff when you are focusing on the relational work. So staff that are employed by educational services, for instance, their interactions become more meaningful, don't they? It's not just the formal therapy sessions when all the staff are working in this way.
And I think too, there's been an attempt recently to encourage people to be more psychologically minded. And I think perhaps I would extend that. I remember Lawrence Jones always used to say to me, it's not just about psychological mindedness, it's also about social mindedness, environmental mindedness. So there's something, for me, in our relational work, we need to be attending to the minds of other people and our own mind. So it fits with all the new stuff on mentalization, that whole idea that if you can actually keep your own perspectives and experience to the front of your mind while you're dealing with people, that it will build in a reflective element to your work. And I think that is relevant for all staff. It's not a special therapeutic skill, it is the work.
Yeah, something about harnessing just being a social animal, isn't it? And harnessing that in a way. You describe how some colleagues would come to your training sessions dressed in their uniforms, and uniforms are a very clear statement of difference within some settings, aren't they? Highlighting the us versus you. Apart from prison officers, uniforms have mainly disappeared. Do you think there are still ways in which we express the differences of our professional groups?
Yeah, I think this thing about, I would say the theme for me on this is othering. When I first started getting involved with some of the development around the no longer diagnosis of exclusion work and the DSPD work, it was astounding how up until that point, people with the problematic diagnostic label of personality disorder had been othered by mental health services. So we'd somehow found ourselves in a position where some of the most vulnerable individuals in the highest levels of distress became seen as somehow not worthy of our help. And when I look back at that, I think, how on earth did that happen? How did we create a system where we could actually reject vulnerable people based on the way we'd label their experiences? And I think that at the time, those advocating for a more compassionate approach were very clear that we hadn't only othered people, we rejected them to such an extent that we were actually being cruel to them. And I think that's the shame of our mental health services in the 1980s. And I think that the work that happened then, although many people argue it didn't create enough change, I think it did attack that capacity of services to reject other people. So part of the difference was maintained by that othering.
Do you think sometimes staff that were associated with advocating for patients were also could be drawn into that as well? Just have recollections of times where working with somebody who'd perhaps acted in a way that staff had experienced as being quite difficult, and it felt as if by representing that person as a therapist, that you were somehow associated with the difficult behaviour also. Is that something that you could relate to?
Oh, very much so, very much so. And I think there was something about how you became an advocate in those situations for people, often trying to protect them from systems that were being hurtful to them. And I think that's something we don't pay enough attention to, is that our systems can sometimes be very cruel and hurtful, and can somehow rationalize that approach as reflecting protocols or security regimes, whatever it is. But I think relational work asks you to attend to your capacity for cruelty and your capacity for actually using your power in ways that are abusive and unhelpful. And I suppose that my whole career, I have been in systems where there are some brilliant staff and there are some awful staff. And the awful staff, I suppose in the early days, I was mostly angry and hostile to them. And I suppose in the later days of my career, I started thinking more about what was going on for people that was making this work so difficult for them. And I think we left a lot of people behind, staff, with their own trauma of the work that they never resolved. And were now, in some ways, acting out in their relational encounters with service users. So I think that it was, and it is part of that bigger issue of how the system turned against people, that at a micro level, a lot of relationships became quite unclearing and rejecting.
I was sorry. I was thinking that this issue about labels and uniforms is to do with pretense, and much of the work that I've tried to be involved in, and I think all three of us actually, has been to do with unpacking pretense. And of course, uniforms are one attempt at maintaining an illusion that there are some people who are in control and who know, and there are others who don't. And I think that's pervasive, actually, and I think it still obtains in many places. I mean, I was thinking, whilst you were talking, Neil, of a hospital where I used to work, where we began from scratch, we began from the ground and built up from there, and we all used our first names, patients and staff, and apart from the consultant psychiatrists, who were still called Dr X or Dr Y, and that was terribly difficult. In fact, it proved impossible to talk about, because it seemed to be threatening to attack a kind of structure, an illusion of power.
I think that there's certainly something for me in the work environments I've been in, when people, and I know it might sound like a cliche, but when people become more authentic and are presenting more as the human beings with the vulnerabilities that they are, then the relational work is far more positive and effective. I mean, I think it's generally accepted that the people who end up in our systems have ended up there predominantly through relational trauma. And the only way that you can heal relational trauma, I think, is through relationships that are meaningful and compassionate and boundaried and in some ways pseudo-parental, offering something people never had. So I think sometimes when these pretenses predominate, that opportunity for authenticity is very diminished. And I think that the highlights of my career professionally are when I found myself with an authentic group of people who have values I share, but who are focused on the individual and their experience in a way that is compassionate. That's when work feels meaningful for me.
Thank you. You often refer to Shawn, Neil. Can you tell us about him and his ideas?
Well, he's a very interesting man, Donald Shawn, and probably the most misquoted man on the planet, as his work is often used by people who I'm pretty sure I've never read anything he's ever written. But I think what Shawn introduced to the lexicon of education was the idea of how experts develop their skills. And he was particularly interested in the idea about where expertise comes from. And my fascination with Shawn's work has come from my realization that therapeutic skills are often learned in therapeutic work, not from textbooks or from theoretical perspectives. And I was particularly interested in his idea. He introduced the idea that you don't only reflect on your actions, but experts reflect in action. So Shawn's notion that in the encounter, experts are actually constantly making sense of what's going on and finding new ways of being in that encounter. And I think that he was quite odd in some ways in that he was a philosopher who ended up becoming very involved in educational design. He was also a very good musician, played the clarinet, and he went to Sorbonne. He was an interesting man. And I suppose that his ideas, for me, introduced something about that idea about how we decide what expertise is. And I became particularly, I suppose, intrigued by the notion of what later was described as practitioner epistemology. The idea of practitioners know and develop knowledge through their practice. And that's been part of my professional agenda, is somehow using those insights both in clinical and development work, but also educational work for staff. But I think what Shawn was arguing against was the idea of the technical rationalist model of education, that we somehow had research-based knowledge here that we just took and applied in practice. And his notion was that came from a philosophically reductionist perspective on human encounters and knowledge. And although his ideas now came from the 80s, I still feel there's a lot of insights in his work that can still help us understand practice.
It's reminding me a bit of David's comments about authenticity and also how we hide behind things as well, because it makes me think about being a trainee therapist, a trainee psychologist, and what's really common amongst those groups are a desire for kind of like structure, as if if you've got enough technical skills and enough knowledge of structure, which I personally think is why CBT is so popular, because people have a false sense that they can go and just apply this rigid structure and everything will follow and they'll be in control of the session. And I think actually the best therapists and the best practitioners are the ones who are comfortable with not knowing and going into the session and knowing that you don't know and that you're going to have to respond more intuitively in the heat of the moment.
I had a wonderful conversation some years ago with a very experienced forensic psychotherapist who was a psychologist. And he was talking to me about when he started, he used to go into these sessions in the room with the client, and he had all his theories in his head, and he was trying to work out what to do. And he was trying to interpret everything that was said with his theory. He was trying to sort of somehow find the right fit in his lexicon of ideas that were in his head. And then he said that one day it dawned on him that going in there and the talking was the therapy. And he stopped. He stopped bringing this stuff in and started being with the person and trying to understand. And he tried to comfort, he tried to clarify, he tried to make sense. And he said then he realized that was the work. And it's lovely. I think I worked many years ago with David Smale, who was a wonderful thinker. And David Smale talked a lot about overestimating our therapeutic potential and how all we really can do is comfort, clarify, and understand. And I think there is something about being more humble about professional knowledge, having more professional humility, I think is a important step in achieving a more authentic way of dealing with people we work with.
Absolutely. And one of the quotations that you reference from Donald Shawn is, "There are those who choose the swampy lowlands." It's an intriguing phrase. What does it mean in our practice world?
Well, I think what Shawn was trying to indicate was that in practice, in the technical rationalist model, there's the idea that you've been given these neat little theories and now you're in the practice world, you're going to use them. And he said that practice was much more like a swamp. There were no bits of solid ground to stand on, no bits where you could collect your theories and have time. It was far more messy. And I think part of good practice and good education is understanding the messy nature of practice. That practice is not something that, it's not, there was that old advert for washing machines years ago, the Sanusi model of science, that you apply science. And I think for me, the notion of the swamp is very powerful, because most of the staff I've worked with, and my own experience, is that we've always been operating in this one.
It's a really nice metaphor. I'm rather partial to the idea of whitewater rafting as a metaphor for therapy, but of course that doesn't talk about the getting bogged down by ideas and technicalities in a way that swampy metaphor does. Thank you.
So if I'm understanding you correctly, Neil, what you've just been talking about really is about how therapy in your mind is being in touch with the person rather than having nice theories. And I'm guessing, but you can confirm this, that this connects with another idea, another phrase that you use, which is of creating and selling homemade theories. Is that right?
Yeah, well, I think that is an actual, as they say in qualitative work, an in vivo quote. So when I interviewed therapists about how they manage their work, they said that a lot of the work they did with the individual, and this was particularly with a quite suspicious, resistant population who had not applied to do therapy or were actually having therapy done to them because they were incarcerated, that there was a live encounter of negotiating a way of working together that meant you had to find a way of using theory to suit that person, and that it was very individual, and that you moved around and you were trying to find a language between each other that you could help the person to talk about their experience. So I think the notion there was that therapists in these settings were not, I think that the metaphor we were using from our own metaphors was the babushka doll. That these therapists had multiple models of therapeutic training that they were incorporating in a live way. And they weren't like the trainee that's been attracted to the CBT model following the manual. They were much more flexible and using the encounter to decide on how to work with the person. So that notion of, one person said that they often had to get the person to come back into the room, and that was a selling job sometimes. Because if you didn't get them back into the room, you couldn't do anything anyway. So you had to really get them to come back.
Thank you. That's really helpful, I think, and it's making me think, because I was going to use the word eclectic, but I don't think you're really talking about eclecticism.
No.
You seem to be describing having plenty of knowledge and experience, but going into the room and meeting the person. And of course, one of the things that Wilfred Bion is often quoted as saying is going into a session without memory or desire, and that seems to be fairly close.
Well, I think there is something about the reality of what goes on in a room. I think there is something about, when I was exploring this experience for therapists, there was something that struck me about their lack of pretense. They were quite willing to be actually acknowledging that it wasn't as easy as everyone thought it was, and that they found the work quite difficult. This was very experienced therapists. And that notion of, if you don't stay with the person and what's going on in the room, your theoretical stuff's no good to you, really. It's not helpful. And it's not advocating people shouldn't have theoretical frameworks, but it's saying that the work is not about applying these in a certain way. It's about using them as retrospective frames of understanding, I think, a lot of the time.
Yeah, very well put. Okay, so if you think that you've given us a good idea of your underlying model, perhaps we can move on to your next big innovation. So Naomi and I have been particularly interested in seeking out things that have made a positive difference. And of course, the Knowledge and Understanding Framework, KUF, has been, I suppose, the major attempt to change culture in our field for the past 10 years or more. How did the idea come about, and how did you get into it?
Well, it's quite a complicated history, but I was working at Rampton at the time. I was running a program on working with personality disorder. I was involved with a home office development around the DSPD services, and I was on some committees and groups that were about looking at workforce development at the time. But when the No Longer Out of Notice of Exclusion document was published, there was an accompanying capability framework called Breaking the Cycles of Rejection. And when that had sat for a while and been thought about, and the Department of Health and Ministry of Justice decided they wanted to receive bids for a training that was systemic, multi-leveled, that would actually improve the workforce's approaches to understanding with, working with, and being more compassionate towards people who received a personality disorder diagnosis. So I was involved in a bid for that training, and I spent several months working with, we had a partnership, the Tavistock and Portman, Gina Barrett from the Tavistock and Portman, Rick Haig from the Royal College, Cass Lavelle and Lou Morgan from Emergence, and myself, Eddie Kane and Vicky Baldwin from Institute of Mental Health, and the Open University. And we created a bid, which was then successful. And we were then given £1 million to say, develop a training. We had 1 year to do it, and this was at least a 5-year project. So we then set about developing a multi-layered educational approach from awareness to a master's level program. And I spent that year visiting services, speaking to service users, staff, with a whole group of colleagues around the country, collecting ideas, field testing ideas. I mean, I met yourselves at many of the DSPD service annual events. We presented various things. So we field tested materials, and then from that we developed an awareness level training, a bachelor degree and a master degree. And the 2 higher level programs were validated by the Open University. So we've got that done as well in a year period. So how I'm still here to tell the tale, I'm not entirely sure. It was a bit of a full-on couple of years.
So just to clarify, how does the training actually work? You seem to be suggesting there were 3 different levels of training.
Yeah. A lot of people who know the KOF only know it at the awareness level, which is either a 3 or 2-day workshop with online materials, time to reflect back and practice, and then 2 further days reflecting on the issues. And that was going to be directed at the entire workforce: health, social care, criminal justice, voluntary sector, right across. And then the degree and master's programs were for staff in a more specific or specialist role, who were working then in what were the pilots for the personality disorder developments across the country, in England and Wales particularly. And
I was just going to say, Neil, that as I remember it, there were some aspirations in the early days that everyone from the doctor's receptionist to the most senior consultant would get the training. How far do you think it's progressed in sort of unrolling that?
Well, I think that was definitely the aspiration, and that definitely happened. I think that as the money ran out, or the money changed after austerity hit, the middle part of the development, the degree part, was badly affected. But we reckon to date, and there aren't exact figures, but we reckon around 100,000 people have done the KOF. And I think that has been running in parts of the country. I remember at one point I used to have a when I was managing it all, on the website where the training materials were, I had a login of all the services that were currently doing a KOF training that day, because they'd have to log into training. And that ran to, at one point, 25 pages. And that was everywhere from high secure women's services to homeless hostels. So it was being spread around. I think the part of it that was probably most important was that it was always delivered by a service user and a professional. So the whole KOF was co-produced long before it was a fashionable thing to talk about or do, and it was trauma informed long before that was a fashionable thing to talk about and do. And I think that early work was fascinating in some ways, because a lot of people who came to the early trainings, and I think in the first year I ran probably well over 100 KOF trainings, and we would meet staff, and on the first day of training, some of that othering would be so evident. There'd be a service user training with me, and people would be saying, I used to think it was a bit like someone being explicitly racist in a room with people of colour. Somebody actually, people would say things that were horrible in that first day, and there was something about how somehow we'd allowed a discourse within our own systems that was so rejecting and so discriminatory about people with this stigmatizing diagnosis. So I think in the early days, we saw quite a radical shift in people's thinking through the 3D awareness. Transformational shifts. Having the service user there also challenged a lot of the stigma. Seeing someone in a very competent facilitated role who was very reflective and able to talk about their own experience, it really challenged staff's attitudes in the room. And I think that the encounters between staff across disciplines were hugely powerful. So I think it did make a difference, but there was always lots more to do, and many people went back into systems where they were re-socialized into more negative frames of reference. And I found that a lot with prison staff particularly. Some of the prison staff in our earlier programs were so insightful, so willing to think differently, but worked in systems that made that very difficult for them. So we were quite sensitive at one point about how people often had a very positive, transformative learning experience, but then went back into some very toxic systems that often undermine that learning.
I was just thinking how resilient that person with lived experience must have had to have been each time you were running those courses to be able to tolerate that level of stigma being present in the room. Just thinking what a useful podcast conversation that could create as well, actually.
Yeah. Well, I think that we were very privileged to have a group of service users, many whom had themselves gone through therapeutic community treatment programs. So in some ways, they were used to being in groups, and they were very good at keeping thinking going under fire. But I think it was at that point, Emergence, which was the service user organisation involved, had a very sophisticated support network, and people like Kath Lavelle and Lou Morgan, who were the real pioneers in this, in some ways, their presence in the KOF shaped it completely. And in some ways, although there was a lot of powerful professional minds trying to think through what was needed, that service user dimension really shaped the values and ethos of the KOF across its different levels.
That's really very, very interesting, Neil. I remember you saying to me once at the end of one of those big conferences that if you had £1 for every time you delivered the training, you'd be a very wealthy man. But of course, what you do have is a wealth of experience of encounters with those groups of people, which I think is extremely valuable, and we ought to think. Well, it ought to be written up in some way, and we ought to think of some way of propagating that message, because it's so relevant to all the other trainings that go on in both health and prison service settings, that particularly that you can make an impact on the individual or a couple of individuals, but then back in the bigger pool, the prevailing culture can become overwhelming.
Yeah. Well, I think you're wanting. I was very sensitive, and we were aware of this with our master's students. Many of them worked in some quite pioneering services, but there was always the challenge that bringing new ideas into an institutional space is always a challenge. And often people would come to us and say, you need to get all the managers on the course, because they're the ones who don't understand. And I think there was something about that we at master's level particularly tried to equip the students with the insights of how hero innovators do get destroyed by organizations, and that the way you implement change, you have to be very sensitive to the dynamics of the organization to do that effectively.
Thank you, Neil. I love following you on Twitter because you post some fantastic pictures of the Scottish coast taken on your walks, and clearly that's very important for you and something that you find uplifting. But over the course of your career, you haven't always lived so close to the Scottish coastline, have you? And I wondered how you've kept yourself sustained and refreshed beyond Scottish coastline.
Well, I think that when I was younger and fitter, I used to run probably about 60 miles a week. And I would often take myself off to the mountains. So I used to do an annual week where I would just go and be in the mountains and sit on top of them and think about what I was doing at work was quite small in the big scheme of things. I think in terms of professional resilience, I think it was about associating with people with shared values. I've found that the sustenance of working with compassionate people who really valued those they were working with, I think that was the most sustaining thing in a professional context. I think that early on in my career, I found myself in I suppose, a bit isolated in environments that I felt were too toxic to be functional within. And I suppose my experience over the years, particularly in places like Rampton and with the KOF work, was finding a like-minded group of people, and that would create innovation in the group because people could share their ideas and also be very challenging to one another. So I think that was the main way that I sustained myself. But I did like to disappear to the mountains.
Thank you very much, Neil. It's been really good to hear your reflections back on your, such a long career and of doing things in an innovative way over a long period of time, not just for a short window at the end.
Yeah, thanks very much indeed, Neil. I love that phrase, associating with people with shared values. That's a terrific mantra.